A few of you guys have pointed out that I'm pretty behind on reviewing one spooky card for every single day in October. It first got behind during the YCS. I was pretty good up until that point, but once the YCS weekend happened, I had some uploads that maybe weren't my normal content, and then I didn't have time to put in those Halloween reviews. And then the next week, I just didn't upload that much. I uploaded like 1 or 2 videos over the course of like 5 or 6 days. So I'm a little bit behind on there, maybe more than a little bit behind, but I'm going to try to catch up, or at least mostly catch up in today's video as much as possible, because what I've been thinking about is how can I review a bunch of cards in one video but still have one cohesive like thought instead of just being, oh, here's a bunch of zombie monsters. And then I noticed that almost a year ago, like early November 2018, we got the Zombie Horde structure deck, which brought 9 new zombie themed cards. So in today's video, we're going to look back with hindsight now at every single new card in the Zombie Horde structure deck and sort of talk about if they made an impact or if they didn't make an impact on the competitive Yu-Gi-Oh landscape. What's really interesting here is that you can actually go back, I mean, you don't have to, but you can go back and watch when I first opened that structure deck, and many of the cards that I thought were going to be really good actually ended up not being very good, and some of the cards that I thought wouldn't be played at all actually ended up being very, very good in modern zombie deck lists. So in today's video, we're going to look at 9 cards, all 9 of the new cards from the Zombie Horde structure deck that came out 1 year ago, and we're going to talk about how good they were in the competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG format, and all of these cards will count towards spooky Halloween cards for October. Oh, and even though this card wasn't new in this structure deck, I still feel it's important to at least read through Zombie World so you guys have more context for all the cards we're going to look at, because pretty much all of them have to deal with this card in some way, shape, or form. So this is a field spell card from a little while ago, actually the last zombie structure deck, and it says all monsters on the field and in the graveyards become zombie monsters. Neither player can tribute some monsters except zombie monsters. So for a while, the only competitive play this card really saw was as a floodgate against different decks that maybe tribute summoned or needed different types on their field. But these days, this card actually does see competitive play, not just as a floodgate, but actually as a good field spell in this deck with all the cards we're going to talk about in today's video. First up, we have the successor to the last zombie structure deck's main boss monster, and that is Red-Eye Zombie Necro Dragon. So this is one of the 2 cards that was on the cover artwork for the structure deck, so it's mainly like the thing you're trying to go for when you build the structure deck out of just the structure deck copies. I mean, this is sort of like the main theme of the deck, at least, or it envelops a lot of the main themes, and this is a level 7 synchro monster. It takes 1 tuner plus 1 or more non-tuner monsters, so pretty much as generic as it comes. Several of these zombie synchro monsters that have come out in the past take specifically Plague Spreader Zombie, but this one can just take anything. Obviously, you want to use this thing with like Unizombie and other such cards. This thing says it gains 100 attack and defense for each zombie monster on the field and in the graveyards. When another zombie monster is destroyed by battle, you can special summon 1 zombie monster from either graveyard to your field. You can only use this effect of Red-Eye Zombie Necro Dragon once per turn, so it's a hard once per turn ability, sort of like Goyo Guardian, but a little bit better than that actually, because you don't actually just have to steal the monster card that is destroyed by battle. You can just revive whatever you want, so it can be something from your opponent's graveyard, it can be something from your graveyard. Both of these effects here, the attack gaining effect and the stealing effect, are really supposed to work with Zombie World, because Zombie World was a new card during the last zombie structure deck, and that theme is sort of carried on in this card and in this deck as well. So this card, this Red-Eye Zombie Necro Dragon, can gain that attack and defense even if your opponent has monsters in the graveyard, as long as you have Zombie World up, and also it can revive zombie monsters because Zombie World makes both players' graveyards just full of zombies, so it can revive your opponent's monsters as well. This thing did, unfortunately though, not see any competitive play even in the zombie deck lists that were topping. I'm not sure if they even tried to play this card, which is funny because I guess the extra deck space was just so tight. Even though there's so many cards that you can play in a zombie extra deck, 15 cards sounds like a lot, but when you really get down to it and you need to fit in Link monsters and Synchro monsters and Xyz monsters and all these different types of cards, you might not have room for something like Red-Eye Zombie Necro Dragon. So even though it was played in a couple of those early lists, in general, when we look at the most successful zombie lists from like the past year, this card isn't found too often. However, that being said, I want to point out that the other card that was on the cover of the structure deck, this big Doom King level 8 monster, was actually very, very competitively viable and currently is still being played in modern zombie decks. This card is so insane. I remember reading this card for the first time a year ago and thinking, holy crap, how are we at the point where this thing can actually be released? Because it's just that strong. So like I said, it's a level 8 monster, it's a zombie, it's a dark monster, 2800 attack points, 2000 defense points, and this thing just has so many crazy effects. So let's go through them one by one so you guys get a good picture of what this thing is actually capable of accomplishing. It first says during the standby phase, if a face-up card is in a field zone, so not just yours, if it's just a face-up card in the field zone, either one of them, and this card is in your graveyard, you can special summon it in defense position. So it keeps bringing itself back every single turn. Ideally, you want to do that when you have Zombie World face up on the field, but it can also be used if your opponent destroys Zombie World and they play like their own Dragonic Diagram or something along those lines. It says you can only do that once per turn, so obviously if you have multiple copies of this card, you can't just keep bringing them back during every single standby phase. You can only bring back one at a time. And then it says once per chain, when a zombie monster except this card or a card with this card's name activates its effect, except during the damage step, you can apply one of these effects, but you cannot apply the same effect of Doom King again this turn. That's pretty wordy, but basically it means each time a zombie monster activates its effects on either side of the field, keep in mind here that Zombie World changes all the cards on the field and graves to zombie types, you can do one of these effects once per chain, but you can't do the same effect twice per turn, but you are allowed to do each effect in one turn. So the first thing you could do is negate that effect that was activated. Now, if you're activating your own zombie monster, you probably don't want to do that, but if your opponent is activating a monster card while you have Zombie World face up, that's one of the ways that you can negate that ability. And then the other ability is that you can banish one monster on the field or graveyard. So there are a lot of ways you can use these effects. Like I said, the first one is usually going to be done when your opponent's monster uses an effect. You can just straight up negate it as long as you have that Zombie World face up. The second effect, though, can also be used if you want to use it aggressively. You know, if you're using effects on your own turn or on your opponent's turn, you can use that to banish a card without targeting. Really huge there that, yes, that second effect, or that last effect I should say, does not target. You just get to banish a monster from the field or graveyard. Your opponent will have to do any responses before you actually select which card is getting banished. Let me just say this, if you're playing a zombie deck in 2019, this card is the reason you're doing so, because this really ties in all of these Zombie World strategies together in one card that's a really strong main deck boss monster. I'm not saying this is the best card in the game, but the sheer amount of ways that you can summon this thing, either special summoning directly from the deck or sending to the grave with Unizyme and then reviving it with Mizuki, or perhaps even just reviving it with its own effect during the standby phase. I mean, it's just crazy how much you can recur this card, and I mean, that's exactly what you want out of a card. You want something that takes advantage of your field spell while also being really independently good if you're just activating your own zombie effects, which now have the potential to sort of banish cards on your opponent's side of the field or graveyard, even if you don't have the Zombie World face up. While zombies definitely can and should be used for synchro summons and Xyz summons and link summons, what really is like the star of the show for a zombie deck is just a main deck effect monster, and you definitely want to be playing this card at least 1 or 2 copies in every single zombie deck. Tatsu Necro is a monster card version, or at least a spiritual successor to a synchro monster that came out a little while ago. It's the main like new tuner monster in this structure deck. I mean, there are other cards, but I think this is one that they were really selling. It's very clearly designed to summon that red-eye zombie Necro Dragon. So this says if this normal summon or set monster would be used as a synchro material, one monster in your hand can be used as one of the other materials. So that's basically like the exact same effect as the synchro monster as well, if you guys remember that card from a few years ago. If you do this, all materials for that summon are banished instead of being sent to the graveyard. And then also lastly here, this is just when it's face up on the field, you're restricted to only special summoning zombie type monsters. Very similar to how the guard dragons restrict you to only summoning dragon type monsters. That's what this card does, but in a slightly different way because it's on a main deck monster, not an extra deck monster. And if you haven't heard of this card before, I wouldn't blame you at all, because this card hasn't really even been played casually as far as zombie decks go, and especially hasn't been played competitively. The main problem with this card is that modern Yu-Gi-Oh decks, but especially modern zombie decks, don't really struggle with getting monsters out of their hand or out of their graveyard onto the field for synchro summons and for link summons. So for a card like this to actually be viable, you need to have it in a deck or have it in an archetype that actually struggles to get cards out of its hand. Because most zombie decks actually don't have that issue though, this card really hasn't been played. And then we have the card that surprised me the most out of all of these cards, because this is actually one of the things that really tied together the modern zombie deck in ways I didn't really understand when I first read it. So Necro World Banshee is a level 4 dark zombie monster with 1800 attack and 200 defense, and it says while on the field, Zombie World in the field zone cannot be destroyed by card effects. Also, neither player can target it with card effects. That's kind of cool, but more importantly, the second effect here is a quick effect that says you can banish this card from your field or graveyard, activate one Zombie World directly from your hand or deck. You can only use this effect of Necro World Banshee once per turn. So when I read this card initially, I was focusing way too much on the on-field effect because, to be completely honest, preventing Zombie World from being destroyed or targeted doesn't matter in most situations. You do have a lot of ways, including this card, to actually put it back on the field if it gets removed, so it's not a big big deal. However, I severely undervalued the graveyard effect, or I guess it's an on-field effect as well, the banishing effect we'll say, because that effect is just so good in these zombie decks. Because yes, you have terraforming, and nowadays you only have one terraforming, but you still have one copy of Metaverse as well. But with this card, not only is this like 3 extra copies of Zombie World, but it's a card that you can send from your deck to the graveyard with many of your other effects. Things like Unizombie and things like Foolish Burial and plenty of other zombie support cards or dark support cards or monster support cards can send this card directly from your hand or deck to the graveyard to trigger that effect and help you get Zombie World on the field. What's also really cool about this effect though, the second effect, is that if your opponent manages to remove the first Zombie World with like Nightmare Phoenix or Nightmare Unicorn, as long as you have this card on your field or more likely in your graveyard, you can banish it as a quick effect during their turn to put another Zombie World face up. This past year, Zombie World has been a really good floodgate against decks like Thunder Dragon, so having a deck that not only can access the card really easily but also thrives when it's face up on the field is a really big deal against a lot of matchups. And that brings us to the last monster card that was in here that was new, and that is Glow Up Bloom. So while Tatsu Necro wasn't a very competitively viable tuner monster, this one actually is, and this is one of the many cards in here that really does help you summon Doom King really easily on the first or second turn. So this is a level 1 tuner monster, 0 attack, 0 defense. It's obviously the zombie version of Glow Up Bulb, which is another great tuner monster, and it says if this card is sent to the graveyard, you can banish this card from your graveyard. You cannot special summon monsters for the rest of the turn except zombie monsters. Also add 1 level 5 or higher zombie monster from your deck to the hand, or if Zombie World is in the field zone, you can special summon 1 level 5 or higher zombie monster from your deck instead, and then it is a hard once per turn effect. So no, you are not usually using this card to add the monster to your hand, but yes, you often are just special summoning Doom King for free. This thing is insanely good. Once again, I keep saying it, but you can send it to the graveyard from your deck without ever drawing it with Unizombie or with other cards, so it makes cards like this really powerful. And you probably don't want to draw this thing in multiples, but just having the option, if you already have Zombie World face up, to immediately send this thing to the graveyard and then special summon Doom King right from your deck is huge. Glow Up Bloom, while it might not be the most important monster in a modern zombie deck, is a very key portion of the ways that you can summon Doom King really easily, and because that card is so strong, it makes this card a really valid option. And that brings us to the final 4 cards, and these cards are all spells and traps that were brand new, and also all of these cards didn't really make it into the competitive TCG zombie decks. I will talk about all of them, at least briefly, and I will spend a little bit more time on the first card because this was the most hyped one, but just know these cards weren't nearly as competitive as these monster cards were, even like compared to like Red Eye Zombie Necro Dragon, which actually did see a little bit of experimentation. So the best spell card by far, the best spell or trap card by far in this deck of all the new cards is Zombie Necro Knives, and this card is really cool. I thought this thing would be like a staple 3 of or at least a 2 of, because it's just Change of Heart but for zombie monsters, which I thought was really awesome. So this is a normal spell card, and it says if a level 5 or higher zombie monster is on the field, target 1 monster your opponent controls, take control of it until the end phase, and it puts no restrictions on what you take, so you can use it for synchro summons or link summons, you can attack with it, all that fun stuff. And then it says during the main phase, if this card is in your graveyard, you can shuffle 1 of your banished zombie monsters into the deck, and if you do, set this card but banish it when it leaves the field. You can only use 1 Zombie Necro Knives effect per turn and only once that turn, so you can't steal a monster then immediately set this thing. It's not quite how it works. What I want to say about this card is that when I first read it, it just seemed so broken to me. Like, it really did. I mean, you have all these like really strong cards like Doom King, and even if you were playing like Red Eye Zombie Necro Dragon, you have tons of ways to get to level 5 zombie monsters. It's not very hard. Not to mention, for every 1 copy of this card you play, you actually get to steal 2 monsters because it resets itself on the next turn while also recycling your resources. The main issue with this card, I mean, there's a lot of issues with this card, but the main issue is the activation requirement compared to other similar options. And the reason this matters, by the way, is that it means if your combo gets shut down in the early stages and you have this in your hand, you just have a dead card, and that's not very good. And while this card isn't terrible, and if it was the only card like it out there, people might actually consider trying it out, but because a card like Mind Control exists at 3 copies per deck, it makes it really hard to justify playing this thing, because Mind Control can be done as your first activation when you control no monsters, or if you have a couple monsters but not a higher level zombie monster, you can almost always activate Mind Control, and while it won't get the long-term value of this other card because it can't reset itself, the other benefits of mind control just simply outweigh that recursion that this card has. So sadly, a card like this didn't see a lot of competitive success, even though on paper it is a pretty decent card. The other spell card is much worse, so we won't talk about it too long. It's called Zombie Power Struggle, and this card is just terrible. I mean, it really is, and I hate to say that because, man, the artwork on this card is insanely cool. You got Doom King there, you got the red-eye zombie Necro Dragon in the artwork, so it's really cool, but it's just not very good. The main problem with this card is that it's just Acts of Despair, and yes, it's a quick play spell card, and yes, if you have Zombie World face up, you can use it on your opponent's monsters to reduce their attack by 1,000, but that's not good enough to be competitively viable. Even with the exact same recycling effect as the other card we just looked at, it's just not quite there, and that's a real shame because the artwork is really cool, and I think that this card could have been better. I mean, if they made this thing also negate the monster's effects, it'd be kind of interesting, right? You could increase your own monster's attack but negate its effects and then maybe hit them for game, or you could use it as like a Widow Anchor on your opponent's turn without the stealing effect. That might have been actually pretty good and people might have experimented with it, but as it stands right now, yeah, just not very powerful. And I'm gonna be honest with you guys right here, I don't know who designed these trap cards, but both Return of the Zombies and Haunted Shrine somehow are both terrible versions of Call of the Haunted. Yes, that sounds really weird, and yes, they're both in the same structure deck, and yes, they're both stuck in a type that has so much recursion it couldn't possibly need anymore, and yet both of these cards in this structure deck that are both trap cards are just worse versions of Call of the Haunted. Sure, maybe in some weird situations they have some minor benefit, but overall these cards are just so darn terrible, and it's really surprising because the rest of the cards we've talked about, even the last two spell cards, at least had some sort of idea to them where they could actually be sort of decent in some situations, but man, these cards are just so bad. I can't imagine whoever designed these what they were thinking, because these cards are just not good enough to even be like played casually in a zombie deck, and that's saying a lot because people will play a lot of cards casually, but in most cases these cards just have no clear advantage over things like Call of the Haunted. I mean, I'm sure in some weird scenarios they do, but in most situations they're just strictly worse. They require more setup and they're more specific. So compared to all the other new cards in this structure deck, even the Acts of Despair quick play spell card that we just talked about, these just seem so bad by comparison. It is just really weird to me that they were included in this deck. Konami could have done something like interesting with these trap cards. I mean, I know it's difficult for a trap card that's not just a straight like Solemn Judgment to actually see play. I mean, we see Salamangreat Roar and Rage see play, and we see searchable trap cards see play, but it seems like a real missed opportunity compared to the other cards, and there are so many different ways that you can make trap cards viable even in a deck like Zombies. If you made them searchable, if you gave them better effects, maybe a destruction effect or an effect negation effect, but as it stands right now, I mean, unless we get some crazy support that specifically works with one of these two cards, I don't really ever see either of these two cards actually being competitively viable or even casually viable because there's just so many other better options. Anyway though, sorry this video was so long. You know, every time I say that I get some supportive comments from people that say, oh, just make them as long as you want, but I can look at the data and I know that you guys generally like shorter videos closer to like 12 to 15 minutes, so this one's going to be a little bit longer. Maybe I'll cut some stuff to get it closer to that timestamp, but I really wanted to cover all these cards in one video. I did consider sort of breaking it up because of how lackluster the spells and especially the traps were. I didn't just want to make one video where I'm sort of just mocking how bad the second half of the structure deck is, so I figured I'd just put all of the cards, all 9 of the cards in one video, even if it ends up being a little bit longer, just so that they're all in one place. Surprisingly, even reviewing all 9 of these newish cards and one old card, Zombie World, in today's video, we're not actually quite caught up with all the spooky cards, and I know at the very beginning I think I said I was only reviewing zombie monsters, and then I expanded it to just Halloween monsters, but over the past couple weeks I've realized that I want to talk about more than just monster cards. I think Zombie World as a field spell was like the first non-monster card. I was like, you know what, this pretty much has to be mentioned just because it's so important to modern zombies and how they're played, so hopefully no one minds too much that it's not just monster cards. I just felt that there were enough zombie spell and trap cards that it was worth putting them on the calendar. Anyway though, thanks for watching today's video. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.